Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Amid sluicing icy rain and the slither of mud outside, flapping tents, Literary Britain is in the middle of its annual book festival fever. And although Start the Week is an austerely and sniffily high-minded institution, who can miss the huge popularity of history, particularly military history? Two of my guests today, Antony Beevor with The Second World War and Max Hastings on the same subject with All Hell Let Loose, bestride the top of the bestseller lists. And the other two, Neil Ferguson and Juliet Gardner, both World War II historians as well, do so whenever they publish. But what does this fascination for the subject tell us? Indeed, what does history itself teach us, if anything, particularly at a time when our institutions are creaking under economic pressure and Europe is again going through a period of doubt and crisis? Neil Ferguson's Wreath Lectures this year plunge into these deep waters. But let's start, like the book buyers do just now, with World War II. Antony Beevor, after all this time, is there really much more to say?
There's a huge amount of material in almost all the archives. You can always come up with new versions, new angles. I don't think there's going to be a major revision in overall terms, but I do think what is vital at the moment is that we bring together all the different aspects of the Second World War, particularly the Far East, when one sees the tensions in the Far East with China and the United States moving 60% of their fleet into South China Sea and the Pacific. So we unless we understand, if you like, the whole of the Second World War in the round, I don't think actually we're going to fully understand the crisis that Europe and other parts of the world are facing at the moment.
So this is partly about escaping the Eurocentrism of earlier accounts of the Second World War, going back maybe to the 70s or 80s.
Yes, I think it's that, and it's also partly the way that the Second World War has actually become the dominant reference point for every crisis and conflict ever since. And this, of course, is a major danger, because history never repeats itself, but you can obviously learn from certain danger signals, and I think that's what we need to do in our study of the subject.
And Max Hastings, in All Hell Let Loose, I mean, you've taken also the huge quantity of individual accounts as a way of adding to what we knew before.
I think two things. One, of course, Andy is absolutely right. I don't think, and I think we'd all agree, it's very unlikely there are any big secrets to be uncovered now about the war. What we're all trying to do all the time is to improve a sense of perspective. That I grew up very much under the influence of my father and his family, who'd adored the war and thought it was all a wonderful adventure. And I went through, as many of my generation did, a tremendous growing up process where one came to realise, and I think it's very well put by somebody I quoted in my own book, a Norwegian hero of the war called Knut Hansen. And he made a statement that seems to me to go to the heart of it all. He said, 6 decades ago, though wars can bring adventures which stir the heart, the true nature of war is composed of innumerable personal tragedies, of grief, waste and sacrifice, wholly evil, are not redeemed by glory. And I think that in the 21st century, we, all of us round this table, appreciate that in a way that the immediate post-war generation, some of them did not. One realises far more civilians died in the war than soldiers did. It was much safer to be a soldier than to be a civilian. We can see things in a different sense.
And yet, Juliet Gardner, I mean, you've written about the Blitz and you've written about the home front as well as about the 30s and the run-up to the war. For a lot of British people, there is a sort of underlying moral or ethical nostalgia, you could almost say, a sense that this was the last time that we were clearly better as a people. You know, we had stronger sense of community, we were less materialistic. And your work suggests that this is not entirely true.
Absolutely, and I think what Max was saying about individual accounts is the point of individual accounts is in a sense that they obviously complicate and make more complex the picture. I mean, at one time we thought that every Cockney sort of emerged from the ruins, you know, clutching an aspidistra and a canary and singing "Willow, they'll always be in England." We now know that in fact those strikes were illegal during the Second World War. There
lots of
strikes. Crime rate shot up. I mean, partly of course because there were more regulations, but I mean looting. If you're an ARP controller, you not only got the emergency services in, you got somebody in to guard the property. So I think we've got a much greater understanding sort of the complexity, and that in a sense is, if you like, the reverse. I mean, the glory bit begins to disintegrate, but they've still got to put the narrative together. We talk about not having a grand narrative anymore, but we still need a narrative. We are all what we might call trade historians. We're writing books which we want the general public to buy, and we need to tell that general public a story. So what it seems to me is very interesting about the Second World War, and which resonates very much today, is how these sort of micro-histories actually, how you get the paradigm shift, when it changes, how it changes, whether it's an extension.
But I would never have guessed 30, 40 years ago when I started writing about all this that everybody would still be reading it in the 21st century. I don't know what the others think, but I think it's partly because the moral issues seem often deceptively simple from that period, and also a sense of gratitude that whatever problems our generation are going through, that they look back at the last lot and they think, well, thank God we didn't go through that.
It's an odd concept, Neil Ferguson, and your book about the Second World War predates these ones. An odd concept that book can be both de-glamorising and also popular.
Oh, I don't think that's surprising. I mean, there is always a danger of what might be called warnography in books about World War II, in which civilians who've never heard a shot fired in anger read with a certain titillation about the unspeakable horrors inflicted on people, usually rather younger than the reader in World War II. And I worry a little bit that this is the kind of market to which Max's and Antony's books cater. What worries me is that while it's great to get in touch with personal experience, and there's an absolute wealth of that in letters and diaries, we begin to lose sight of what actually the war was about. And there are some very big questions about the war that tend to get lost in a mass of personal experience. Why was the violence so concentrated in time and space? In the 20th century, the trend prior to that point, really prior to 1914, had been away from mass organised violence. And suddenly you have these huge conflicts in the mid-20th century. Why? I don't think that those questions are addressed clearly enough in these books. Why were civilians so much more vulnerable than in previous wars? About half the mortality is civilian in all theatres combined. Why was that?
Well, Antony Beevor, you do go back into that territory which Timothy Snyder called the Bloodlands,
yes.
the areas of sort of Eastern Europe and Western Russia. Now, so why do you think that this was a particularly horrific war for civilians?
Well, it was the dehumanisation. I mean, in a way, the challenge for the historian, and this is why personal accounts are important, is to show that you must not generalise, because there are always exceptions to every single rule, and also because you're actually going counter to the trend of the totalitarian regimes, which was to dehumanise and therefore to categorise. And it was that way that, for example, Goebbels, with his diabolical genius, could combine not just hatred, but hatred with fear to produce that totally explosive effect. And I think that actually was one of the real developments, if you like, in the Second World War, and why it was so murderous, and particularly for civilians.
A really important issue which I think needs to be tackled here is why codes of military conduct collapsed. This is particularly important with regard to prisoners. Some of my academic work a couple of I suppose 10 years ago now, was on why prisoner killing became so very extreme in World War II. It made the war last longer than it should have. I mean, you have to explain something here, not just why the war began, but also why it ended. And it kept going long after the Germans really had lost any chance of victory. And it kept going because it was really hard to surrender, particularly on the Eastern Front, but also out in the Far East. That's the kind of issue that interests me, because I think it helps explain. And I think there's a real need to explain this war. And the other thing that's missing, I think, in too much of the experience-driven historiography are the counterfactuals. You know, what were the alternatives? Could the war have been avoided in 1938? Could it have been shorter? Could the Axis actually have won? Was there any strategy that would have delivered victory? And these sorts of questions, I fear, are being buried in a mass of personal experience that readers essentially read for titillation and gratification.
Michael Howard said that grown-up historians don't waste time on counterfactuals. They tell readers what happened rather than
but this is
what
naive,
might have
Max.
done.
This is naive because you can't explain anything if you don't consider the alternatives that contemporaries considered. Remember, Churchill's whole position in 38-39 is a counterfactual. We should have acted in 38. For a historian to ignore the alternatives is to ignore something which
But
is
you
absolutely
suggested your
central.
idea of exploring counterfactuals was you suggested that if the Western democracies had made a deal with Stalin in the 30s, the Second World War might have been avoided.
I've never written that.
I should remember you had.
Not
Okay,
not
well,
at all,
let's-
Max. The argument in War of the World that you don't cite in your book is that that war in 38 was in fact a far better option for Britain than Chamberlain and his colleagues acknowledged.
And that's true despite the lack of monoplanes and fighters and so on that's always
The Germans
cited.
were in a far worse state of readiness for the war in 38 than they were in 39, and the key point is that by postponing the war, the policy of appeasement gave Hitler much more time to get ready, as well as to sign up Stalin. So, correction.
Dead
But that may have been
And
true.
Antony
But
Beevor.
that may have been true.
These are the issues that should be
technologically.
discussed in your books.
That may have been true technologically and all the rest of it, but the truth is that neither the British nor the French populations were psychologically prepared for war, and that is the huge difference. There was no way that the politicians could have actually got them into war, and that was because also they were completely misinformed, rather as the populations of Western Europe are today.
I agree
Juliet,
entirely.
you're the resident expert on that.
Well, yes, I mean, I think they're absolutely right that the populations were not psychologically prepared. I mean, look at the reaction to Munich. I mean, it was universal relief, and it was only gradually, of course. By
Actually, that's not entirely true. If you look at The Economist magazine, it deplored the Munich Agreement. City sentiment, if you look at financial sentiment, which is often cited by people in these contexts, it was not positive about Munich. The markets didn't rally. There was great scepticism about whether anything had been achieved. The trouble is, many of these judgments about popular psychology that I hear being made around the table are not very securely based on research. If you look at the German side, public opinion was definitely not ready for
You
war in
become the
1938
best-known
either.
historical sensationalist of your generation.
I think people who write books about World War II that focus entirely on personal experience are the real sensationalists, Max.
Right, let's move to the next bit that I really want to come into, which is what lessons, if any, one can learn from this period. Because people are constantly citing the Second World War, Antony Beevor, particularly at the moment where we've got all sorts of bizarre front pages in Greece with swastikas all over them and worries about them, jokes about the Germans coming in and taking over again. So what are the dangers of Second World War parallels?
Well, the dangers of all historical parallels are when particularly politicians want to sound either Churchillian or Rooseveltian, with George Bush comparing 9/11 to Pearl Harbor and so forth. In the present circumstances, the dangers are that one automatically is assuming that the events of the 1930s are going to be replicated. There are some worrying echoes, but I don't think one should take it too far, because although we are going to see a certain disintegration of the centre and a certain polarization, we do not have those sort of dominating totalitarian rivals of fascism and communism, and we are living really to a certain degree in an ideological vacuum.
So you mentioned the word ideological. Is it the case then, Max, that actually the biggest difference, which is such a big difference between our times and those times, is the collapse of ideology? We are living in a sort of, indeed, in a political vacuum, which means that drawing any kind of lines between the 30s and 40s, on the one hand, and today, is an almost futile exercise.
Well, I suspect we'd all agree that you can't do it. For a start, Europe's completely demilitarised, so it's not going to be a war. The only historical parallel that interests me, because I'm at the moment writing a book about 1914, and it sometimes seems difficult to understand how the statesmen of 1914, who were not fools and not wicked men in most cases, got themselves into this catastrophe. And I'm not for a moment suggesting we're going to have a war now, but when one sees the degree of political paralysis among the statesmen of the West now, the inability of the leadership to respond, you sort of begin to understand how they could have created this catastrophe in 1914.
Juliet?
Well, of course, in many ways, I mean, it is the story we tell ourselves, as it were, about the past, and the story that we tend to tell ourselves about 1940 was the enormous switch, from a government inactivities in the 30s, etc., to the social contract of the 40s, post-war social contract, if you like. And we like to talk to ourselves about, being unitary and the defiance and all the things that we seem to think we recognise in the British character. But on the other hand, I mean, one of the rather less ideal result of the Second World War was this feeling that Europe could not be trusted, that in a sense Britain stood alone. Of course it didn't, it stood on the back of its dominions and its empire, but Europe was not a place to be, and I think that underlines, and I think that comes to the fore time and time again.
And so on. Neil Ferguson.
I think the real parallel at the moment is with the summer of 1931, when a European banking crisis opened the second half of the Great Depression. I think if you want to draw parallels, you have to draw them in the area of economics and finance, not in the area of military conflict. I agree with Max on this issue. Demilitarization of Europe is an astonishing phenomenon. I think if anybody had been told the levels of military expenditure and armament today, back in 1945, they would have been truly astonished. And we have, to an amazing extent, moved away from militarism in Europe. We're also older, and I think this is another reason why I don't fear conflict in Europe. The
fewer younger people.
Yeah, the thing that comes out when you read these books on the war is it's a war waged by very young people who are quite easy to induce to take up arms. Elderly Europeans today can barely be induced to go and protest in the streets. So I think we can rule out the war scenario in Europe, but I don't rule it out elsewhere.
Well, I was going to say, if demographics count like that, then beware the Middle East.
That's
above all, beware North
Africa.
Africa.
You have a revolution sweeping North Africa and the Middle East, which is, I think, still quite an early stage, and there the demographics are completely different. And in the conclusion of my book on World War II, War of the World, was that if there was going to be anything like the mid-20th century in the mid-21st century, it would be in the Middle East, and certainly not in Europe.
What about the just continuing a little bit on the theme of ideology in all of this? How different are sort of mass popular movements these? Well, there aren't mass popular movements anyway. Is that one of the reasons why the 30s and the 40s feel so different to us? That people thought about the future. I mean, they were wrong, tragically wrong, most of the case in the ideologies they signed up to. But people had a vision of where society ought to go.
Andrew, can I make a point about this? The ideologies that have been cited as prime movers in mid-20th century conflict were actually 19th century ideologies. I mean, communism,
they were
communism and radical nationalism had been around for 100 years when the war began. And that's why it's hard to explain World War II in terms of ideology, because the ideologies were not new. The states that
they were mobilized in a new way, perhaps you could argue.
That's the difference. So we should look not at ideologies, but at institutions and the way in which, say, Stalin's Soviet Union or Hitler's Third Reich were run as states, because they were novel in the way that they could mobilize people on a scale that had never been seen before, and not only mobilize them in terms of action, but mobilize them in terms of thought, convince them that the enemy were not human. I mean, going back to something Antony said earlier, which I very strongly agree with, what makes the battlefield so lethal by the 1940s is that young people have been convinced that the enemy are not human. And once you start thinking that way, then obviously you're going to kill them all, if you possibly can, including the women and children.
And in terms of the motivations for the Second World War, Antony, I mean, you've written obviously a great deal about Stalingrad and so on. How important were the kind of huge mass killings that preceded the Second World War in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the slaughter of the kulaks and so on, in dehumanizing and decivilizing parts of Europe for what came?
Well, the dehumanizing came not just in racial terms as with the Nazis, it came in political terms. I mean, what I thought was fascinating at the end of after the Second World War was when the definition of genocide was debated. The Soviet Union refused to have any element of political genocide included in that definition. But before the war, we saw not just the kulaks, we saw the famine in Ukraine and all the rest of it. But also remember the Spanish Civil War, where again, going back to the youth, one of the problems of course was that been that huge boom in the birth rate in the First World War in Spain, which of course meant that there were so many unemployed youths in 1936 on both sides, on right and left. But again, you had this political dehumanization. And that was bound to lead to and feed into this vicious circle of fear.
Max Hastings.
I was thinking about what we were talking about earlier about the treatment of prisoners and the brutality of the war. I'm not totally convinced that it's without parallels. In fact, if anything, I would have thought that throughout history, in a lot of wars, that in certain circumstances the combatants behaved incredibly badly to civilians and sometimes very badly to soldiers. And for example, in our colonial wars, whether it's in the Zulu War or at Omdurman or whatever, that not much was done in the way of taking prisoners or caring for the enemy wounded. But the difference I would have thought then is nobody wrote about it or nobody said much about it, though Churchill did after Omdurman. But I would have thought throughout history there have been periods, all that changed in the 20th century, we sort of expected everybody to behave better, and they didn't. But
Churchill did write about Omdurman, and he was scandalised at the cruelty that was shown towards the Mahdiist forces. But no civilians were being killed at Omdurman. It was an expeditionary force that was very, very far from its home base by the time that battle was fought. And remember that in World War II, Churchill explicitly says killing prisoners is a very bad idea, and he signals to his own commanders, as well as indirectly to the Americans, who were much more guilty of this, that this is something that would prolong the war. So no, I think, Max, this was different. What was being done by the Germans and by the Japanese and by the Soviet forces in particular, and increasingly in the Pacific War by the Americans, the take no prisoners ethos was novel, and contemporaries observed that and commented on it, including Churchill.
Juliet Gardner, I'm interested in, and we're just picking up the sort of argument going on here about personal stories and personal reminiscences. How far, is a difficult one, are historians driven by suddenly released volumes of evidence of one kind or another, by letters and diaries and stuff, by accounts coming out of the Soviet Union that weren't previously available? How far are they driven by the sources rather than shaping the sources, as it were? Everyone wants to shape the sources, but...
Well, I mean, I think that's an extremely good question, actually. I mean, obviously, sometimes, you know, particularly the Soviet, I would have thought the release of the Soviet archives has made a considerable difference to certain aspects of which Antony's obviously written about frequently, that we have thought about the Second World War. But I mean, often, as I was saying, what one is doing, this is in a sense the point, whether the diaries and letters and things, they're always there. They're not really suddenly released. I mean, it's the optic shifts. We have become, since the 60s and 70s, we've become much more interested in the experience, if you like, in put in inverted commas, of ordinary people. Those people that didn't show up in the historical record, you know, people who didn't have witness testimonies, and things like oral history, and your interest in women, interested in working class history, all that. So it's broadened our field.
And you would argue that without that access, then we are stuck with previous myths, for instance, about how people behaved during the war, people's attitudes to...
I think we're partly stuck, but I mean, also, obviously, we partly begin to, I mean, by definition, you don't need to hold on tightly to the story of valour. I mean, you needed to do that for a time after the Second World War. You can begin to dissolve that. You can begin to look at sort of human nature and all those things. The optic shifts, and of course, then you start going to these sources, which are very wide. And there are, as Antony said earlier, there is an enormous accumulation of sources which are still untapped.
And are you genuinely surprised when you come across letters and diaries and so on? Do you find material that makes you rethink, or is it just the devastating little detail that makes you happy as you come back from the archives?
Well, I think I'm much more reassured when I find that actually I'm wrong, that it doesn't underline what I find in the archives, that it doesn't underline...
We're all changing our minds all the time, aren't
Yes,
we?
I think this is what is terrifying about, if you like, the continental approach, whereby you should have your thesis and then you select the material to support that thesis. I mean, in a way, the advantage of the British narrative tradition going back to Gibbon is that one shouldn't be doing that. One's duty is to understand rather than try to put the material together.
So what sort of things have surprised you, not just in the last book, but in ones before? What really brought you up short when you came across the letters or the diaries or whatever?
Well, a huge list of things. I mean, I had no idea of the degree of organised cannibalism in the Japanese army at the end of the war. I mean, that was just one area which had been completely suppressed at the end of the war.
I'd give one example, and that's the Mass Observation Archive at Brighton, which is sort of primitive opinion polling or opinion sampling. And when one sees that in the winter of 1939, a lot of British people couldn't for the life of them understand why we were going on with the war, that they felt we'd gone to war to save Poland, and Poland had gone, and we didn't seem to be doing anything. And they felt a sense of futility about what they were doing, which only changed, really, in the following summer, when, after the German invasion of Norway and France, and after the Luftwaffe started raining down, then people could see there were only two choices, which is, do you surrender or do you fight? But that winter of 39 feeling, that's not a secret. The material's been there for donkey's years, but when you see it, you're still fascinated.
Evelyn Ward's a good source for that as well. I was
just thinking that, I mean, it is also the kind of the current political climate which enables people, or encourages people to look back to find, you know, something which justifies, if you like, the view that they want to take. I'm thinking perhaps in Germany at the moment, the number of memorials that are being erected, in fact, to deserters from the German army. I mean, this, in other words, that is a form realm of individual opposition. I think that would have been unthinkable perhaps 20 years ago.
Yes.
Let's move on a little bit. So the end of the Second World War, one of the things that seems to have gone on, certainly in this country and others too, is a sense of one generation had let down other generations in the 20s and 30s, and it wasn't going to happen again. And we get into the interesting question of the balance of fairness, not just between different social groups, but between generations, which leads me to Neil Ferguson's Reith Lectures, because you're looking, Neil, at really the failure of Western institutions in all sorts of aspects, financial, social, political, and so on. But your first lecture starts with this notion of, takes up this notion of what a properly integrated political structure is, that it's not simply fairness among people who are currently alive, but it's looking back and it's looking forward.
Yes, well, the question I set myself for the Reith Lectures followed on pretty naturally from the last book I did, Civilization, the West and the Rest. And the question was, why is the West losing its dominance? I don't think that can be answered simply in terms of Asian success, or for that matter, Brazilian success. I think it has to do with a fundamental erosion of Western institutions. And so these lectures each look at a part of that problem. And the first one is concerned with the way in which our democracy is no longer fair on future generations. In fact, it's deeply unfair to them. We usually see this in the symptoms. All this discussion that goes on today about public debt, debt to GDP ratios, austerity versus stimulus, is really just a discussion about the symptoms of a fundamental inequity between the generations. The way that we have lived, by we, I mean our generation around this table, who would be called the baby boomers in the United States, we have lived in such a way as to leave a huge bill to the next generation. Part of this is on the balance sheet in the form of public debt, and part is off balance sheet in the form of various unfunded liabilities of the welfare state. This is a real inversion, it seems to me, compared with the World War II generation, when the feeling was that the young had made a great sacrifice and were owed a better life after the war. That's all, I think, been turned on its head. And the next generation, who don't get to vote, that's their problem. I mean, they're either too young or they're not born. They're going to face an absolutely huge hike in taxation, or the effective abolition of the welfare state as a result of these unfunded liabilities. I think this is a really important part of what's gone wrong with democracy. We're very used to going around the world telling people, not least the Chinese, how wonderful our institutions are. They can, I think, legitimately say, really? Well, how do you explain the fact that you, plus the Japanese, you British, have the largest debt to GDP ratio in the world?
Do you think that there is an inevitable sort of senescence or weakening in institutions which are only sort of generationally shaped human organisms, as it were?
Well, I'm very allergic to the notion of inevitability in history, but I think it's true. Manker Olson, the late Manker Olson, made this point that institutions over time will tend to degenerate, no matter how well set up they are. The American Constitution is a fantastic document, probably the best ever constitution designed by humanity. But over time, like all institutions, it is subject to a couple of corrosive effects. One is the corruption that will come into any system where large amounts of money are changing hands. The bigger the federal government has got in the United States, the more the tendency has become for it to be a magnet for vested interests and lobbyists.
And how far do you buy the argument that Western democracies, based on a 4 or 5 year electoral cycle, are, by the nature of the way they're set up, ludicrously short term, given the challenges ahead? We may, abhor lots of aspects of the Chinese communist structure, but these are old men who seem to be thinking 20, 30, 40 years ahead at least, and sort of assume there's going to be a continuity that allows policy to carry on for that long.
Well, I don't buy it. I mean, the election cycle hasn't radically changed since Edmund Burke made his great argument for the contract between the generations in his reflections on the revolution in France. And I think, although China is doing tremendously well, it is still prone to the kind of failures that all centrally planned one-party states are prone to. Plans go wrong. That, you could have come back from the Soviet Union in the early 1930s saying, I've seen the future and it worked, because you'd have seen
Lots
a massive construction.
Yes.
Right, and people did. And yet, things go wrong with planned economies. And this is a point I'll be making in the Reith Lectures. Unless China can transition to a meaningful rule of law in which private property rights and individual rights are protected, it will not be a sustainable and stable system over a 10 or 20 year time horizon.
Max Hastings.
Don't we have moments of feeling, I don't often feel sorry for politicians, but when one looks at the British and American governments and all the Western governments at the moment, the problems are so vast and intractable of trying to sell to an electorate the notion that they're going to have less of everything than they've had in the past, that I do feel jolly sorry for them, because I think it's terribly difficult to do, isn't it? Or is it?
I agree with that. I think one of the difficulties of being a politician, perhaps the central difficulty, is that whatever you may do that is preemptive in nature, you get no credit for. For example, and this is an example I cited in the discussion in the first Reith lecture, nobody today gives any credit to George Osborne for having preserved the credibility of the British state as a sovereign borrower. Now, we see on the continent what happens when you lose that credibility. Greece lost it, Italy lost it, Spain lost it, and we didn't lose it. But does he get any credit for that? No, we get endless complaints. The midterm blues have set in. And I think that absolutely makes your point, Max, that even if you do the right thing as a politician and avoid what could have been a real bond market panic, 2 years ago when people were talking in the US about gelignite underneath the British gilts market. Even when you successfully avoid something like that, you get almost no credit for it.
No. Anthony Beevor.
But the short-termism of politicians is partly because no Cassandra will ever win an election. And I do think it's terrifying, particularly at the moment, that they cannot face up to or even explain the realities. Because, again, going back to the artificial differences of the 1930s, both generations were, in fact, completely uninformed. But then the threat of war, if you like, was likely to unify. But, of course, nowadays it's divisive, the economic crisis.
So here's something I've often thought about. You're all historians. You can tell me, has there ever been a sustained period in democratic politics where politicians were coming to the electorate time and time again saying, do you know what, life is going to get materially worse for some considerable time? The honest answer is that we can't come and offer you more goodies if you vote for me. Has any democracy gone through that period and sustained itself?
I think Britain in the late 19th century was characterised by a certain pessimism about how long the empire could hold. And that's why you got proposals like tariff reform from Joseph Chamberlain. That's why ultimately you had the People's Budget from the other side of the political spectrum from Lloyd George. I mean, when I go back 100 years to the period before the subject that Max is now working on, before the First World War, I'm always rather impressed by how candid British politicians were about the problems Britain faced. In fact, I think sometimes they rather exaggerated them.
They did have the advantage of not yet a full franchise, of course, which may have helped.
Sure, and the widening of the franchise is a crucial factor here, but it was still a lot closer to democracy than most countries at that time.
And the great change was the control of the media. I mean, or the power of the media. That is one of the great contributions to a politician's lack of moral courage in certain terms, surely.
Do you remember that great story of Sir William Harcourt when young Winston Churchill went to lunch with him, and young Winston is usually enthusiastic to say, and what happened next? And this old Victorian statesman said, my dear Winston, my long experience in public life teaches me that nothing ever happens. To which Churchill, of course, when describing this conversation years later, he said, in my experience, ever since he said that, nothing has ever stopped happening.
Juliet Gardner, I was wondering, we've talked a bit about the 30s and the dangers of 30s parallels, but, carrying on from the theme that Neil Ferguson's been talking about, we'll be talking about in the Reith lectures, of sort of bad news coming and politicians being prepared to rub people's noses in grim times ahead. To some extent, there are parallels in the 30s or not?
Well, I think if you like, the parallels in the 30s are, of course, there was always the call to action. I mean, there was a general feeling that the First World War had been something that had been got into by an older generation. Then, obviously Mosley is an extreme example, but he would call the government the old muttons, and there was this feeling throughout the 30s, I think, that the government didn't know how to act if they were culpable, and actually, of course, that persisted into the Second World War. I mean, an awful lot of resentment, when there was difficulty, when there were panics and things, was the feeling that the government was not prepared. They were not trusting the people. They were not resourcing the people in order to make the sort of preparations.
One relevant parallel here is that Chamberlain regularly argued that he was constrained by the size of the debt that had been left by the First World War. And that was true, because the debt at the end of the First World War was far larger in relation to gross domestic product than our national debt is today. A very large part of tax revenues was going just on paying the interest on that debt. That also constrained the government in terms of economic policy. But there's a big difference between running up a debt to fight a world war and running up a debt as a result of mainly welfare as opposed to warfare. And that's, I think, another big difference. There was a sacrifice made then. People recognised that the debt at the end of 1918 was a part of that sacrifice.
The price
and
that had been paid.
they sought not to inflate it away nor to default on it. Our debt is different.
Juliet.
But one of the arguments, of course, of Chamberlain for for appeasing, for not rearming, particularly, was that in order to rearm would mean cutting the social reform budget. In other words,
particularly the housing budget.
Exactly, the housing budget. And basically, you had a population which was not reconciled necessarily to government. You did have a very uneasy population in certain terms in the 30s. So I think that parallel is continuing.
Antony Beevor.
Well, and of course, the only Cassandra of that period in the form of Churchill could only come to power after the crisis had exploded.
One of the possible parallel areas we haven't talked about much is the sort of structure of the European political system, and in particular the role played by Germany. Antony Beevor, you've already said that you're concerned by easy parallels being made. Nonetheless, we are at a time when Germany does bestride and dominate the continent in a way that hasn't happened for a very long time, he said cautiously.
Well, yes, I mean, the bad jokes about the Fourth Reich and all the rest of it are going to continue and probably spread. But I always thought it was very significant that Radek Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister, showed in that well-known speech, it sort of said that I fear German inaction more than I fear German power. Whether that will be the same case in, say, 10 years' time is difficult to tell. But what one is very concerned about is the way that the very fact of Germany probably having to run the economies of a number of countries through the European Central Bank, because it will be the dominating power, is going to, of course, provoke that nationalism again.
Well, a long time ago now, I wrote an essay called The Kaiser's European Union, one of these counterfactual essays that Max disapproves of, making the point if Britain had not intervened in 1914, which was clearly an option, it was discussed very heatedly by the cabinet, what Germany would have created would have been essentially a continental European customs union in which Germany was the dominant player after what would have been quite a short war that I think the Germans would have won probably within a year and a half, maybe even less. Now, at the time, many people thought this was wild Eurosceptic nonsense, including, I think, the then editor of the Daily Telegraph.
But you thought this would not be a bad outcome.
Well, it would have been a better outcome from a British point of view. And we are now at the point...
couldn't buy that.
We are now at the point when what is emerging on the continent is a German-dominated customs union. Now, what the Germans, and here I agree with Radek Sikorski, don't quite want to face is that if they want to have the benefits of monetary union, they are also going to have the costs of fiscal federalism. The big issue in Europe right now is how quickly Angela Merkel can make ordinary Germans realise that this thing comes with a pretty hefty price tag.
Well, here is a very interesting parallel, because exactly a similar sort of choice that might have faced Britain in 1914, it could be argued faces Britain now, where you have majorities in the opinion polls against the membership of the EU, certainly of any kind of deeper EU, at the same time as we have a potentially deeper, stronger German-led EU taking place in front of our eyes.
If the Germans create a fiscal federal system, Britain will not be part of it.
No, I think this is true. I don't disagree about that, but at least we're not threatened with war. I think where I've never been able to agree with Neil about the notion that it wouldn't have mattered that much to Britain if the Kaiser had won the First World War. I think the Kaiser's Germany would have created something very unpleasant indeed in Europe, and something that would have been very strongly against the interests of Britain and everybody else. But you take a more benign view about that than I do.
Well, I hope you won't misrepresent the Kaiser's Germany in your new book, because it was a very different Germany from the Germany of 1939. That's one of the central arguments of my work over the years.
But if this was true, they massacred 5,000 Belgian and French civilians during their invasion of France and Belgium. I wouldn't call that a benign regime.
But remember that you're discussing a war which Britain had already intervened in. I mean, you're not, in other words, you're not discussing my counterfactual.
You don't think they would have massacred the French and Belgian civilians if we hadn't joined the war?
Absolutely. I don't think that you're talking about the same war. If the British had not intervened, it would have been a very, very different Western Front operation.
Anthony, what would you say to people who, are fascinated by all the books pouring out at the moment about the Second World War and indeed about the 30s and the period, and conclude that really it's not entertainment, it's higher entertainment. It's a way of, educating yourself about the world, but it tells you absolutely nothing about today's world and the future. What would you say to them?
Well, I don't entirely agree with that, because I think that the prime duty of, as I say, of the historian is to understand and to convey that understanding. And I think it's terribly important, because I found I didn't understand well enough to see how all of those different areas of the Second World War fitted together and how they affected each other. And that does affect the world today, particularly in the Far East as well as in Europe.
Same question to Max Hastings.
I think we can learn a lot about human behaviour and human experience from the study of the Second World War, and I'm not persuaded that we can learn a great deal of guide to the future. I mean, I'm much more interested. I would like to hear Neil's view about whether there is any grounds for hope. We've talked so much about the past. I'm rather interested in whether there's any possible benign outcome of the scenarios we're looking at rather gloomily this morning.
Well, I certainly think there's a risk of the disintegration of Europe in the near term because the financial system is very precarious even after the Spanish bailout. But I'd still say the higher probability scenario is that they pull back from the brink and create a federal Europe. I don't think Britain, as I've said, will be part of that.
We won't be comfortable with necessarily, but will not be bad news for us long term.
I don't think that will be a disaster for us, but we won't be part of it. But my worries, and perhaps my cautious optimism, relate to the rest of the world. If there's going to be a major war in our time, it won't be in Europe. It'll be in North Africa and the Middle East, where a great revolution is unfolding, the consequences of which we can't foresee. If there's going to be a major superpower conflict, it won't be in the Atlantic region, it'll be in the Pacific between the US and China.
Old problems, Juliet, and the same kind of people facing them as we've always been.
Yes, I think, this is always the question, isn't it? Would we have pulled together? Would we have now, had the Second World War broke out last year, would we all been the same? My argument is yes, probably. I mean, the same complexities, exactly the same sort of feeling of unity in the face of an external threat, etc., etc. But also, I think this is the point about writing our history, the Second World War, and it goes on writing about it, is the fact that one is deconstructing all these sort of myths all the time and seeing how they fit into the next instalment.
Well, thanks to wise diplomacy around this table, conflagration hasn't quite broken out in the start of the week studio. Thank you to all my guests. Juliet Gardner's busy with her latest project, which is a history of the home front on the First World War, to be published in 2 years' time. Antony Beevor's The Second World War and Max Hastings' All Hell Let Loose are both out now. Both Antony and Max will be appearing at the Chalk Valley History Festival at the end of June. Neil Ferguson's Wreath Lectures begin on Tuesday, the 19th of June at 9 in the morning. Next week, science takes centre stage with David Nutt, Mark Henderson, David Blunkett and Jill Rutter. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
Integrate, but they've still got to put the narrative together. We talk about not having a grand narrative anymore, but we still need a narrative. We are all what we might call trade historians. We're writing books which we want the general public to buy, and we need to tell that general public a story. So what it seems to me is very interesting about the Second World War, which resonates very much today, is how these sort of micro-histories actually, how you get the paradigm shift, when it changes, how it changes, whether it's an extension.
But I would never have guessed 30, 40 years ago, when I started writing about all this, that everybody would still be reading it in the 21st century. I don't know what the others think, but I think it's partly because the moral issues seem often deceptively simple from that period, and also a sense of gratitude that whatever problems our generation are going through, that they look back at the last lot and they think, well, thank God we didn't go through that.
It's an odd concept, Neil Ferguson, and your book about the Second World War predates these ones. An odd concept that book can be both de-glamorising and also popular.
Oh, I don't think that's surprising. I mean, there is always a danger of what might be called warnography in books about World War II, in which civilians who've never heard a shot fired in anger read with a certain titillation about the unspeakable horrors inflicted on people, usually rather younger than the reader in World War II. And I worry a little bit that this is the kind of market to which Max's and Antony's books cater. What worries me is that while it's great to get in touch with personal experience, and there's an absolute wealth of that in letters and diaries.
The United States moving 60% of their fleet into South China Sea and the Pacific. So we unless we understand, if you like, the whole of the Second World War in the round, I don't think actually we're going to fully understand the crisis that Europe and other parts of the world are facing at the moment.
So this is partly about escaping the Eurocentrism of earlier accounts of the Second World War, going back maybe to the 70s or 80s?
Yes, I think it's that, and it's also partly the way that the Second World War has actually become the dominant reference point for every crisis and conflict ever since. And this, of course, is a major danger, because history never repeats itself, but you can obviously learn from certain danger signals, and I think that's what we need to do in our study of the subject.
And Max Hastings, in All Hell Let Loose, I mean, you've taken also the huge quantity of individual accounts as a way of adding to what we knew before.
I think two things. One, of course, Andy is absolutely right. I don't think, and I think we'd all agree, it's very unlikely there are any big secrets to be uncovered now about the war. What we're all trying to do all the time is to improve a sense of perspective. That I grew up very much under the influence of my father and his family, who'd adored the war and thought it was all a wonderful adventure. And I went through, as many of my generation did, a tremendous growing up process where one came to realise, and I think it's very well put by somebody I quoted in my own book, a Norwegian hero of the war called Knut Hansen. And he made a statement that seems to me to go to the heart of it all. He said, 6 decades ago, though wars can bring adventures which stir the heart, the true nature of war is composed of a new...
We begin to lose sight of what actually the war was about. And there are some very big questions about the war that tend to get lost in a mass of personal experience. Why was the violence so concentrated in time and space? In the 20th century, the trend prior to that point, really prior to 1914, had been away from mass organised violence. And suddenly you have these huge conflicts in the mid-20th century. Why? I don't think that those questions are addressed clearly enough in these books. Why were civilians so much more vulnerable than in previous wars? About half the mortality is civilian in all theatres combined. Why was that?
Well, Antony Beevor, you do go back into that territory which Timothy Snyder called the Bloodlands,
yes.
the areas of sort of Eastern Europe and Western Russia. Now, so why do you think that this was a particularly horrific war for civilians?
Well, it was the dehumanisation. I mean, in a way, the challenge for the historian, and this is why personal accounts are important, is to show that you must not generalise, because there are always exceptions to every single rule, and also because you're actually going counter to the trend of the totalitarian regimes, which was to dehumanise and therefore to categorise. And it was that way that, for example, Goebbels, with his diabolical genius, could combine not just hatred, but hatred with fear to produce that totally explosive effect. And I think that actually was one of the real developments, if you like, in the Second World War, and why it was so murderous, and particularly for civilians.
A really important issue which I think needs to be tackled here is why codes of military conduct collapsed. This is particularly important with regard to prisoners. Some of my academic work a couple of, I suppose 10 years ago now, was on why prisoner killing became so very extreme.
Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Amid sluicing icy rain and the slither of mud outside, flapping tents, literary Britain is in the middle of its annual book festival fever. And although Start the Week is an austerely and sniffily high-minded institution, who can miss the huge popularity of history, particularly military history? Two of my guests today, Antony Beevor with The Second World War and Max Hastings on the same subject with All Hell Let Loose, bestride the top of the bestseller lists. And the other two, Neil Ferguson and Juliet Gardner, both World War II historians as well, do so whenever they publish. But what does this fascination for the subject tell us? Indeed, what does history itself teach us, if anything, particularly at a time when our institutions are creaking under economic pressure and Europe is again going through a period of doubt and crisis? Neil Ferguson's Wreath Lectures this year plunge into these deep waters. But let's start, like the book buyers do just now, with World War II. Antony Beevor, after all this time, is there really much more to say?
There's a huge amount of material in almost all the archives. You can always come up with new versions, new angles. I don't think there's going to be a major revision in overall terms, but I do think what is vital at the moment is that we bring together all the different aspects of the Second World War, particularly the Far East, where one sees the tensions in the Far East with China. And
Memorable personal tragedies of grief, waste and sacrifice wholly evil are not redeemed by glory. And I think that in the 21st century, we, all of us round this table, appreciate that in a way that the immediate post-war generation, some of them did not. One realizes far more civilians died in the war than soldiers did. It was much safer to be a soldier than to be a civilian. We can see things in a different sense.
And yet, Juliet Gard, I mean, you've written about the Blitz, and you've written about the home front as well as about the 30s and the run-up to the war. For a lot of British people, there is a sort of underlying moral or ethical nostalgia, you could almost say, a sense that this was the last time that we were clearly better as a people. You know, we had a stronger sense of community, we were less materialistic. And your work suggests that this is not entirely true.
Absolutely, and I think what Max was saying about individual accounts is the point of individual accounts is in a sense that they obviously complicate and make more complex the picture. I mean, at one time we thought that every Cockney sort of emerged from the ruins, you know, clutching an aspidistra and a canary and things singing Willow, they'll always be in England. We now know that in fact those strikes were illegal during the Second World War.
Lots of
strikes. Crime rate shot up. I mean, partly of course because there were more regulations, but I mean looting. If you were an ARP controller, you not only got the emergency services in, you got somebody in to guard the property. So I think we've got a much greater understanding sort of the complexity, and that in a sense is, if you like, the reverse. I mean, the glory bit begins to,